At the time of this video's recording, I've reached the halfway point of One Piece, finally getting to the post-time skip period of the show. But before I dive too deep into the new world and, well, whatever's ahead in the next 500 or so episodes, I wanted to discuss what seems like the greatest side quest ever for Luffy and company, the Skypiea arc. More specifically, there's one part of Skypiea I consider the emotional centerpiece of the saga. The story of Mont Blanc Noland and the great Shandian warrior Kalgara is the missing piece of the larger story in Skypiea. It's a pretty traditional story you've most likely heard before about a foreigner and native forming an unlikely friendship. But in the context of Skypiea's greater themes about having faith over fear, its meaning becomes the catalyst for those who have lived through both the truths and lies surrounding Skypiea, and how all it takes is one small reminder to remember what's most important. The Skypiea saga is part religious fairy tale and legend, part history lesson, mixed nicely together with your standard One Piece world building and battling flair that of course leads to Luffy eventually squaring off against the arc's big bad, the self-proclaimed god Anaru. Skypiea's fairy tale flavor adds a lot of charm to a story that starts off innocently enough with subjects and imagery about dreams never dying, an island in the clouds, sky knights, angel-like citizens, a giant jack, and the discovery of El Dorado before the harsher reality kicks in and the Straw Hat's mission becomes to save Skypiea and its citizens. But prior to the crew even finding this island in the sky, we're introduced to what seems like a harmless fairy tale with a children's story about a liar. When the crew sets their sights on finding the mythical Sky Island, they first journey to Jaya to dig up information on its whereabouts and eventually find their way to the domain of Mont Blanc Cricket. There they find a children's book with a cartoon caricature of a man with a chestnut on his head and an idiotic smile gracing its pages. The title is Noland the Liar. The story is straightforward and simple. Long ago there was an explorer who told stories of his adventures, so fantastical that some questioned if they were even true. One day he spoke of how he came upon an island with a mountain of gold. So the king of his homeland asks Noland to take him and 2,000 men on a voyage to see the wonder in person. After a treacherous voyage and being reduced down to just 100 men, they finally arrive on the island to find only a jungle and no mountain of gold. Noland is therefore sentenced to death for lying, but before being executed, his final words are, "I know, the mountain of gold must have sunk into the sea." No one believed him anymore, but he stuck to his lies until the very end. That's when a man with a similar chestnut atop his head emerges from the water. Mont Blanc Cricket attempts to fight off the intruding Straw Hats, but he quickly collapses from fatigue as a result of his life-risking diving he does day after day for years. His mission? To find this alleged mountain of gold from this old children's book. As silly of a story Noland the Liar is, it turns out he was a real person, and Cricket is his descendant. Cricket recollects on how his family name has been haunted by the lying legacy of Noland. So when he was younger, to escape the shame and humiliation, Cricket became a pirate captain and took to the Grand Line, until by chance he stumbled upon the island where Noland the Liar once said there was a mountain of gold. A place many of his ancestors had tried to reach but never could. But Cricket makes one thing clear. He's not personally looking to clear Noland's name, and it doesn't matter whether he actually finds the gold or not. It's common knowledge within his family that Noland was actually an extremely honest person, and that he didn't die smiling, but with tears in his eyes. When Cricket first landed on Jaya, he found it couldn't be a coincidence. Instead, he felt fate must have brought him to this place. His entire crew abandoned him, leaving him to search alone for the lost gold for more than a decade now. The reason? Cricket says, "This is my battle with the man who ruined my life." Much of Skypiea's story's beats are built on lies, and Noland the Liar sets that theme up early in the arc. What appears to be a harmless children's book with the message, "Do not lie or face the consequences," is actually a lie itself. Because behind the veil is the devastating truth about an honest man with a ruined legacy for 400 years. And the only thing Cricket can do now is to keep fighting for his own sake, and to keep believing in something. And so as the arc goes on, we're introduced to more lies, starting with Skypiea, a heaven-made paradise sitting atop a sea of clouds, with angel-like citizens that welcomes the Straw Hats upon entering. They encounter hospitable residents like Pagaya and Canis, who are happy and seemingly prosperous as they tour them around their wondrous world. But it doesn't take long to reveal the truth. Skypiea is under the tyrannical rule of Anaru, a power holder who not only takes up the governing mantle of Kami, but actually believes himself to be a god that can cast judgment down upon Skypiea. This pleasant picture is shattered when Canis refuses to turn the Straw Hats in for breaking Anaru's laws, followed by a destructive force of lightning coming down upon Angel Island, demonstrating the massive power of Anaru's subjugation. The fear of this judgment is what creates the lie that the Skypieans are forced to live. Ganfor, the Sky Knight, later speaks to this by saying, "When a person cannot act without feeling guilty, he is at his weakest." The same message from Noland the Liar is also echoed here. Do not lie or face the consequences. But in this case, it's more of do not try to escape the lie or face the Kami's wrath. Anaru's reign affects not only the citizens of Skypiea, but also the tribe who was originally landbound called the Shandians. Though they too are at the mercy of Anaru's laws, they continue to fight a war started 400 years ago against the Skypieans, when they were first inexplicably lifted into the sky along with a piece of their homeland, now known as the Upper Yard. The Skypieans saw the event as a miracle. Receiving the Earth, or Verth as it's known to the Skypieans, was a blessing, so they stole the land from the Shandians and deemed it their own sacred land. But for now, the Shandians have drawn their attention to Anaru, who has ruled over the Upper Yard in Skypiea for the past 6 years, and the Shandians' guerrilla forces are led by the ruthless warrior, Wiper. On the surface, Wiper's character is the opposite of those living a lie. He doesn't shy away from the threat of Anaru or cower in fear of his judgment, and he aims to fearlessly rescue and protect the land that is rightfully the Shandians'. There's been a message passed down through the generation that he proudly adopts: bring back the light of Shandora, which is a call to find and ring the lost bell the Shandians once possessed called the Light of Shandora. But to the lengths Wiper is willing to go to in order to achieve this dream and take back the Shandian land comes at an unhealthy cost. By the time the Straw Hats arrive in Skypiea, he's so self-determined and filled with hatred fueled by hundreds of years of persecution that he's willing to kill any non-Shandians upon sight. His focus takes away so much attention that he begins to forget the benefit for which he's fighting for: his people. You see this through his relationship with the young Shandian Isa. Isa is terrified of Wiper, and he often disregards her for getting in the way and belittles her treasured Verth from the Upper Yard as a distraction. Wiper is so stubbornly fixated on his end goal that he makes the things his people cherish the most meaningless in the process. In this way, he too finds himself straying further and further away from the truth of what he's really sworn himself to protect. Not only the land, but the hopes and dreams of his people too. However, in the midst of Anaru's apocalyptic attempt to sink Skypiea into the sea, a defeated Wiper looks to the sky where Luffy is restlessly climbing up the giant jack, trying to catch Anaru's ascending arc. Now sidelined from the fight, Wiper must accept that Luffy is the last chance they have to save his world. But what pushes him to realize this is in a flashback of a story once told to him when he was younger. A story about his ancestor, the great Shandian warrior Kalgara, and how the phrase "bring back the light of Shandora" meant more than ringing a bell or protecting his people. It was also meant to be a message to a long-lost friend. The timing of telling Noland and Kalgara's story during Skypiea was a brilliant move on Oda's part. Waiting until right before the epic conclusion was masterful in terms of emotionally hooking us to not only want to see Anaru's defeat, but now bringing peace to 400 years of lies, legacies, and conflict was also on the line, making Luffy's promise to ring the golden bell of Shandora so much more meaningful knowing what's at stake. In this moment, a character like Wiper, who had only disdain for outsiders, is now required to put his trust in one, just as his great ancestor did with his once foe-turned-friend, Mont Blanc Noland. Noland turned out to be anything but what the cartoon caricature depicted him as in the children's book. Rather, he was confident, strong, and compassionate, and most importantly, an honest captain and brave leader. Sailing the seas with his loyal crew, he journeyed island to island as an explorer and botanist, trading crops and medicines with people he'd meet along the way, and spreading a message of progress all over the world. On the night of a violent storm, Noland hears the faint sound of a soothing bell calling to him, so he lets the sound guide him through the storm until it brings him to the island of Jaya. There he discovers the village of Shandians, who have been cursed with a deadly plague. Meanwhile, the chief elder of the Shandians, who was known to hear messages from the gods, perishes from this plague. But before he dies, he orders his tribe to make a human sacrifice to pay tribute to the Kashigami, a god that takes the form of a giant snake. A young woman named Moose is selected as the sacrifice, and she dutifully accepts this responsibility, showing the normalcy of such traditions. One young warrior named Sato then notices a spot on his body and flees into the jungle, realizing he's contracted the disease. The great warrior and protector of the tribe, Kalgara, finds him crying and desperately trying to scrape away the mark. Sato tells him he only wished to grow up and be like Kalgara one day, for a chance to become a courageous warrior that could fight and protect the land like he did. Sato's fear feels so hopeless, regardless if a sacrifice is made or not. But Kalgara must keep belief that the ceremony will work, because it's the only hope they have. There's never been anything else but these traditions to believe in. Later, Noland comes upon Sato, who initially refuses him. Noland has seen this particular plague that ravages people and crops alike before, so he quickly moves to prepare vaccines for the crew and Sato, knowing he has little time to save the rest of the Shandians. When the sacrificial ceremony begins, the great Kashigami finds its way to the altar where Moose awaits. Before it can strike though, Noland leaps from the water and beheads the snake. Horrified, Kalgara attacks Noland. Noland insists that human sacrifices are a barbaric practice and that the Shandians shouldn't resort to killing their own people. He begs for a chance to provide a cure, but Kalgara catches him off guard and neutralizes him. Noland doesn't give up though. He asks for just one day. The panicked Shandians cry out, fearing the punishment the gods will now dish out upon them. But Noland stands his ground, determined to foster progress where he knows it'll work. He swears he will provide a cure, and the only thing he asks in return is for the Shandians to never hold these savage ceremonies ever again. The new elder chief senses his wisdom and surprisingly agrees to the offer, but he holds Noland's crew captive just in case. When Kalgara asks the chief why he chose to believe Noland, he responds, "I don't have the power to hear the voices of the gods. However, even I can hear the words of a wise man." Noland starts his search through the jungle to locate a tree that will provide the antidote for the plague. The Shandians meanwhile remain fearful of the gods' vengeance for Noland's actions. Kalgara assures them though, that if he senses the slightest danger to the village, he won't hesitate to kill the foreigner. The warrior then walks out to find Sato, shocked and surprised to find himself cured from the plague. He simply asks Kalgara, pondering Noland's words, "What is progress?" Kalgara freezes for a second to process, but then an earthquake kills the moment. Instinctively reading this as judgment by the gods, Kalgara dismisses the miracle he just witnessed and rushes off to kill Noland. However, when he finds him, Noland is helplessly stuck between two plates of earth as a result of the earthquake. And Kalgara can only laugh and see this as justice served by the gods. Badly injured and weak, Noland shrugs off this thought. He says the gods must not be that tough if they're unable to kill one man. Kalgara says he'll watch over Noland until he dies, but the explorer doesn't give up. He shows his strength and resolve by slightly moving the earth to free himself, but he's still unable to get out. The day passes on and Noland exhausts himself trying to escape, but to no avail. So he pleads with Kalgara by questioning his fears. "You're frightened of some unseen terror, offering up human lives to just make yourselves feel better. Human sacrifices aren't about the gods at all. They're selfish acts. They're pointless sacrifices." The child of the Kashigami snake then appears. He approaches the trapped Noland, preparing itself for an attack. But Noland remains steadfast and continues on by adding, "No matter how great your gods are, people's lives are more precious." His words slowly begin to hit a nerve with Kalgara. The warrior shows his pain by revealing the woman to be sacrificed was his own daughter. Noland refuses to let up and begs him to believe him. He tells them for 60 years now, there's been a cure for this plague and all he needs is a chance to show him. Knowing he's running out of time, with his crew and all of the Shandians' lives on the line, he cries out with one last desperate plea, Are you that afraid of the gods? And then, Kalgara remembers the elder's words from before. I don't have the power to hear the voices of the gods. However, even I can hear the words of a wise man. Kalgara can no longer ignore that he trusts Noland's words now, more so than his fear of the gods. To protect his people, he finally has to take an action that puts faith over fear, and he kills the Kashigami just as it jumps at Noland. Stunned, Kalgara ponders about what he's just done. Was what he killed a god or simply a snake? He's completely terrified, having thrown away tradition in favor of seeing some shred of hope in a stranger. But with no way to undo what he's already done, he lets go and transfers every bit of belief left to Noland. With tears in his eyes, he asks, "Will you really save my precious village? Can you save it?" Noland assuringly responds, "I can." Noland's men are able to administer vaccines to the village, and the plague is eradicated. Noland and Kalgara as a result become great friends, with Noland and his crew being treated as celebrated guests in the village. Kalgara shows Noland the area the Shandians are sworn to protect, an unbelievable city made of gold called Shandora, as well as the source that led Noland and his crew to the island in the first place, a giant golden bell called the Light of Shandora. Kalgara says the sound of the bell is really a message to their ancestors that died, so that their souls will always be able to find their way back. A message that says, "We are here." Kalgara offers Noland's crew as much gold as they want for their return journey home. All is well between the natives and explorers as they spend time together ringing the bell each day and sharing a peaceful and joyful experience that the Shandians had never done before with outsiders until now, especially with the connection between Noland and Kalgara. But one day, the crew finds themselves being avoided by the members of the village, and on this particular day, the bell remains quiet. Understandably confused, Noland asks Sato to talk to Kalgara, but Sato frustratingly tells them to just leave already. Elsewhere, Kalgara glooms over a destroyed forest and vows to kill Noland if he ever sees him again. This forest was said to house the ancestors that the Golden Bell would call home. Upon learning this, Noland feels deeply ashamed. He orders his crew to leave the gold behind as an atonement, and they quietly set sail from the island. Even though Noland considers himself a man of progress, this wasn't about dated tradition. This was a disgrace to Kalgara's people, in this case, his ancestors. But before they leave, a crew member is able to tell Moose why they cut down the forest. It turns out the trees were already dead and infected from the same disease that spread before. If they didn't remove the trees, the plague would have surely returned. He tells Moose, "Trust me, the Admiral doesn't hate gods or deities. It's just that he always knows what's most important." Once Kalgara finds out the truth, he rushes to the shore to catch the departing ship while the bell starts to ring once again. He calls out to his friend, "We'll always be here, always," telling him to come back and that they'll be waiting for him. Like how the bell is meant to call the ancestors home, Noland, an outsider, is offered the same. Years later, the village still waits for Noland, and each day the bell is rung to guide him back. But before he can do so, Shandora and his people are blown into the sky and land atop Skypiea. There, the greedy kami immediately lays claim to the sacred land as a throne for his kingdom, and Kalgara begins to fight the centuries-long war against the Skypeans. But even still, he continues to worry about his friend Noland, and what he'll think when he returns and doesn't find him there. During their ascent into the sky, the Golden Bell goes missing, so the message to bring back the light of Shandora gets lost in the years of war ahead. But nevertheless, the story and truth are faithfully kept alive. Meanwhile, the story events of Noland the Liar finally takes place. When Noland does eventually reach the island again with his king in tow, he discovers the village and city of gold gone. As a result, the great explorer is sentenced to die, thus creating Noland's failed legacy as a liar that would follow him long after death. But like Kalgara, Noland doesn't concern himself with his legacy or execution. Instead, he only worries about his friend and the other Shandians. The only thing he wishes for is to hear the bell once more, so that he knows Kalgara is safe and sound. And so a story that began maligned with fear and distrust, that blossomed into a strong kinship between two men, comes to a close without a fairy tale ending. But that promise to return continues to be eternal, passed down through generations in ways that, for better or for worse, would prove that the story was far from being truly over. Though it takes 400 years, as Wiper stands before a chance for the bell to ring once more, another lie dies, and the hidden truth comes clean. All it takes is one simple reminder like Noland and Kalgara's story to peel back the truth from a string of lies. And that truth is always faithfully rewarded. For those in Skypiea, the Straw Hats are that reward. From the moment Canis refuses to turn in the gang because she knows they're good people, her faith is rewarded when Luffy scolds her for putting herself in danger, becoming the launchpad moment for the crew to take on Anaru and his vassals. In a similar way, the untrusting Wiper is rewarded after he finishes recalling the story of Noland and Kalgara. He remembered that there's more to bringing back the light of Shandora than just what it means to his people. Once he learns that Luffy is aiming to ring the bell so that Cricket, the descendant of Noland, can hear it, he helps make the dream of his ancestor come true by risking his life and using the reject dial a third time to topple the giant jack to send Luffy flying towards Anaru's arc. Which brings me to my final thematic point. How it all comes down to a dream, as it so often does with One Piece. From the moment a giant pirate ship falls from the sky, to Blackbeard delivering the line, "Dreams don't ever die." The subject of keeping faith in a dream against all odds is widely explored in Skypiea. No moment captures this better than when Luffy and Zoro refuse to fight back against Bellamy when he harasses them for having dreams, and how that era has now come and gone. Luffy's choice not to fight is at first a curious move, but I also believe that if Luffy were to fight back in defense of himself being a dreamer, that would only prove that Bellamy's threats have weight to them, and that sort of insecurity could get under Luffy's skin. To not react is to show the strength and confidence he has in his dreams. Zoro says to Nami later about not fighting, "It's heartbreaking when you're only left with pity after a fight." And sure, this reads as Zoro being confident in his ability to beat these guys, but I like to see it as a testament of respect for their dreams they know will come true. After all, Luffy only decides to one-shot Bellamy when he goes a step beyond mocking someone's dream by stealing Cricket's gold, and by association, trying to destroy what Cricket's dream represents and has accomplished. So needless to say, Jaya's storyline is a wonderful precursor for the rest of Skypiea, and its own tests of faith I've discussed. I'd like to actually wrap this up with Cricket's story. First, let's go back to the moment where he says he doesn't care if he finds the goal, and how he doesn't care about clearing Noland's name. He says this is his battle with the man who ruined his life. But what does that really mean? I think Cricket is devoted to the dream at hand, not anyone in particular, but rather to embrace whatever dream fatefully falls into his lap. You can see this in the way he doesn't hesitate to put his search on pause to help the crew reach Skypiea, or how he's on to the next romantic adventure with his comrades after the City of Gold has been proven to exist. Cricket only waits for his faith to reward his dream and holds on to nothing in between. And you can see this in one of the most touching parts of the arc, when Cricket is listening to the sound of the ringing bell. He sees the casted shadow of Luffy dancing above in the clouds. Shedding tears, he admits that he's just glad that they're all safe and okay, just as Noland and Kalgara had wished for each other. Even with proof that El Dorado exists in his hands, Cricket can only focus on what's most important. No matter how great the obstacle, dream, or deity, no matter the years of failed legacies, ridicule, or fighting, regardless of fear, tradition, and judgment, people's lives are more precious than anything else.